I've got 3. Lord willing, we'll see. Tonight may be our last night to use these, so who needs one? I got 2. Right. He said we might get raptured. Hey, wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Got you. Oh, that's Miss Debbie's right there. Miss Debbie, you just cheat and look over her shoulder. I know it's yours because it's tore there on the bottom. Eric and Bradley has it memorized. That's impressive right there, I'm telling you. Well, we've been doing this far longer than I intended to, so perhaps we do have it memorized. But we are on the final view of the millennium, and we started it last week, and it is the view known as dispensational premillennialism, okay? And I told you this is probably the view most of us are most familiar with, that we've probably been taught through the years. And so I'm hopeful that maybe we can get through it in 2 weeks, maybe 3, so maybe a little less time than some of the other views. But let me get us caught up, right? Each of these views has to do with that 1,000-year reign described in Revelation 21 through 6, okay? And its timing in reference to Jesus' return, okay? So in amillennialism, right, that means there is no physical, literal millennial 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth. Instead, when is that millennial reign? In amillennialism. It's now, right? It's now. It is the reign of Christ in heaven. And the saints who have died believing in him, they are reigning with him in heaven, okay? And so that is the millennial reign in amillennialism. And postmillennialism is the idea that first there is the millennium, and then Jesus comes. So postmillennialism, after Jesus comes, or the millennium is, let me get that right. How do I phrase that? Jesus comes after the millennium, right? Post-millennial, that's the way to say that. And so the millennium comes in through the preaching and spread of the gospel throughout the world, right? That there's this golden age of righteousness and peace throughout the whole earth, that over time, the earth is on a trajectory towards moral goodness, okay, as the gospel goes throughout the world. And then Jesus reigns through the heart and lives of those who have come to know him. And then he returns, okay, at the end of that time. And then the last view is premillennialism. And there's 2 views in that, right? And so it says, when is the millennium in return in reference to Jesus' coming? Right, it's after, okay? Or Jesus comes before the millennium, right? That's, you say it both ways there. So Jesus comes literally, physically to the earth, and then he establishes a physical 1,000-year reign on the earth, okay? And there's 2 views in that. We looked at historic premillennialism for several weeks, okay? And some distinctions of it, namely that Jesus comes one time, right? When he comes, there is a calling up a rapture of the saints who are alive. Those who have been in heaven are raised. And those who are left are raptured to meet him in the air. And then he immediately comes and establishes his reign on the earth. Okay? One coming. And there's one resurrection when he comes. And then a few of the more distinctives are that the church goes through tribulation in this view. Through the tribulation. That the tribulation is life throughout the church age for believers. Okay, that they will be persecuted, oppressed, and martyred for their faith in the tribulation. So then we started looking at dispensational premillennialism last night. Okay? And so let's think about it just a minute. What is a dispensation? We talked about it last week. You remember what a dispensation is? There we go. A dispensation is a period of time in when God deals with or manages or relates to the world, okay? And we said that in dispensationalism, typically, traditionally, there are 7 dispensations, okay? And the final dispensation is the millennial reign of Christ, okay, which has to do with pre-millennialism. And so you can see the basic timeline if you have a sheet, or I think I may still have it up there as well for dispensationalism, okay? So we have the church age now, okay? And then there is the rapture of the church. Then there is a 7-year tribulation on the earth. Then there is the second coming of Jesus. Then there is the millennial kingdom, okay? Followed by a final rebellion, a final judgment, and then the eternal state, what we call the new heavens and the new earth, okay? And so we started looking at some distinctives of this view last week, and the first is the rapture of the church. This is distinctive to this view, not that the other views don't believe in a rapture in the sense of a calling up to meet Jesus in the air, but this view sees the rapture differently than the other views, and it's that Jesus comes secretly, okay, to take the church out, okay, for that 7-year period known as the tribulation. So in this rapture, this view of the rapture, Jesus comes for his church and takes them out before that 7-year great tribulation begins. So Jesus doesn't physically come to the earth in the rapture. He calls believers up to them, and then what happens? He takes them back to heaven, okay? Takes them into heaven while the earth experiences 7 years of tribulation on the earth. And we likened it to, if you've ever read the Left Behind books or seen the Left Behind movie, right? There's this rapture where people are called away, and then those left go through that 7-year tribulation on the earth, okay? Questions about that? All right, so we briefly started talking about another distinctive in this view, and that is the 7-year tribulation. And really, we kind of need to start over here, okay? So we'll have a little overlap and review from last week, okay? So after the church is raptured into heaven, okay, then the earth enters a future 7-year tribulation. And so we asked the question last time, where does this 7 years come from? Okay, do you remember what we said? The book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 9. If you want to open there or look on the screen with me, however you would like to do that. Daniel chapter 9 is where this 7 years comes from. So it's Daniel 9, 24 through 27. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one. So who remembers, what is the Hebrew word for anointed one? Messiah. Messiah. Okay, so the coming of a Messiah, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. And for 62 weeks it shall be built again, with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one, Messiah, shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So this is where the idea of a 7-year tribulation comes in, okay? That a future 7 years, a future Antichrist, and a distinction between Israel and the church. And so think about the context of Daniel 9. Okay, we did this last week. Daniel is in exile, right? Where is he? Do you remember? Babylon. That's right. He's in Babylon. He's in exile. And he's been praying. He's been confessing Israel's sin, which is why they're in exile, right? They turned away from the Lord. And he wants to know the fate of Jerusalem, okay? And he wants to know Israel's future. And Daniel 9 is Gabriel speaking a prophetic timeline to Daniel. And so he says in Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. Okay? And so this is one of the ways in which that sharp distinction between Israel and the church comes, because it says, your people to Daniel, which would be who? Israel, national Israel. Okay, and your holy city, which would be what? Jerusalem. Okay? So dispensationalists come to Daniel 9 and say, see, this is a prophecy specifically concerning Israel and not the church. Okay, so that's the first thing. It's about the people of Israel, and it's about their city, the holy city, Jerusalem. All right? And so next, we need to determine, what does weeks mean? 70 weeks. How long is 1 week in this? We talked about it last week. 7 years, right? 1 week equals 7 years in Daniel. So that the Hebrew word for weeks means 7. Okay, 7. And so, dispensationalists interpret these as 70 weeks of years. Okay, 70 weeks of years. 70 times 70, or 7, equals 490. Okay, so 490 years are in these weeks. And then, in Daniel 9, Gabriel divides these weeks, okay, the prophecy into sections. So we read about 7 weeks, and 62 weeks, and then 1 final week, okay? So the first 69 weeks would be 483 years. From the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. That's Daniel 9:25. And so, dispensationalists interpret this, that these weeks begin when? When Israel's allowed to return to Jerusalem to begin rebuilding. Okay, so think in your mind the book of Ezra. Okay, Nehemiah. That's when these prophetic weeks begin. Okay? Mm-hmm.
The rest, people that don't believe the way they do, what do they think? What are they interpreting?
Sure.
24 to 27 of Daniel 9. I mean, I guess that's why I'm having a little bit of a, I mean, I know there's different views on it.
Sure.
But when you read this, so everybody's not looking at this and looking at it the way the dispensationalists do?
No.
So what are we looking at it in reference to?
Sure.
What is this?
Well, the first 69 weeks are clear. Like, that's clear. It's from the time of the word to go and rebuild until when? The anointed one is cut off. So we say that's the death of Jesus. Okay? That's the 69 weeks. From the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem to the anointed one being cut off. That's 69 weeks.
So that would be the 490 less
483, right. 483 years. And so then we still say, no matter your view, there's a week of 7 years that we have to account for. And the way dispensationalist accounts for them is it's the tribulation. Okay, it's the tribulation. The way a historic premillennial would account for them is they would say that final week is the age of the church. It's the church age, however long that is. Okay. Because the other thing is, and we'll get there in just a moment, like Gabriel to Daniel isn't specific that there's a gap of time between the weeks. Okay? A dispensationalist has to say there's a gap of time in the weeks, right? Because you have the end of 69 weeks, Jesus dies. Okay? And then when does that 70th week start in dispensationalism? After the rapture. Okay? So basically that whole age of the church in dispensationalism isn't in these weeks at all. It's the way they talk about it is there's a prophetic pause button. Okay? There's a big pause on God's plan that picks back up when the tribulation begins. And they say that plan has to deal with who? Israel. Right? So that God's dealing with the church now is the period of time that is the pause in the weeks. And then after the church is raptured out, well, then God continues his dealings with Israel during the tribulation. Sure. Not in dispensationalism. That last week has not begun in dispensationalism. No, not in dispensationalism. Not in my view, it would be the age of the church, and the 7 years are symbolic for that period of time. But not in the view we're talking about tonight, the dispensational view. That final week of 7 has not started yet. Okay? Because that's where the tribulation is. Okay? More questions about that? No. I mean, it is. It's tough to get our minds around, but really it has to do with what is that last week and when is it? The dispensational view says that last week is the tribulation. When is that? After the church is raptured. Okay? The historic view says, what is that last week? It is the tribulation, but that tribulation is the whole age of the church that the church perseveres through. Does that help? Okay. So, one thing that is clear is that it's not clear what the 7 weeks exactly are. Like that, do you see what I'm saying? Like we don't know for sure, okay? So the dispensational says, well, that's in the future, it hasn't come yet, and it comes when after the rapture and the tribulation starts. That's what that last week is. So we have to do something with that final week. And that's what the dispensational says. Okay? So, there's this prophetic gap in the weeks in dispensationalism. Okay? After that 69th week, when Jesus dies, the Messiah, the anointed one, is cut off. Daniel 9 says that. That prophetic clock pauses. And it creates a gap of time between the 69th and the 70th week. And that gap is the age of the church. Okay? Now, Daniel 9 does not explicitly say there's 69 weeks and then there's a gap of time and then the 70th week. Okay? Rather, dispensationalists infer from that, okay, that how many of you have heard really what puts a pause on this is Israel's rejection of the Messiah. How many of you have heard that before? Okay, that's the dispensational view. Okay? Israel rejects the Messiah, so then God's plan for Israel is put on pause, and then that enters into the age of the church. But in dispensationalism, okay, God isn't done with Israel. So when the church is taken out, then the play button is pressed, and he finishes his dealings with Israel. How many of you have heard that before? Okay, that's the dispensational view here. Okay. And during that tribulation, God fulfills the rest of his promises to Israel, and there's this restoration of Israel, okay, as they turn to the Messiah and not reject. Okay? Questions about that? Okay, so let's talk about that final week then. That 70th week, which in dispensationalism is the tribulation. So it's still sometime in the future. Okay? And so if you look at Daniel 9:27, here's how they interpret that. Okay, that during this week, that's what Daniel 9:27 is talking about. During this final week, this 70th week, he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. All right, pause there. Who do dispensationals interpret the he as? Anybody know? The Antichrist. Okay? The Antichrist and that 1 week represents the 7-year tribulation. Okay? And then we read in Daniel 9:27 that in the middle of the week, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And so this final week is structured in 2 3.5-year periods. So in that first 3.5 years, the Antichrist makes a covenant of peace. And then in the middle of the week, okay, he breaks that covenant. How many of you have heard that before? Okay, that's where all this is coming from Daniel 9, specifically 26 and 27. Okay? And the second half of that 7-year tribulation is known as the Great Tribulation, that final 3.5-year period when that covenant gets broken. Okay, and so some key text for that, Matthew 24:21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Okay, or Revelation 13, 5 through 8. And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for how long? Did it say that again? 3.5 years. That's how long 42 months is, right? It's 3.5 years. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it. Everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. So this period of time is viewed as the tribulation. Unprecedented persecution, opposition, martyrdom, wrath, judgment. Okay? And so I think one of the big things, and listen, I'm not a dispensational premillennialist, but one of the big things the view has going for it is that some of Revelation's time references seems to make good sense of Daniel 9, right? Like we just saw it in Revelation 13. This half of the time, half of the 70 of that final week, that 3.5-year period, well, we have a 42-month period mentioned right there in Revelation 13. Okay? So, dispensationalists connect Daniel's final week, okay, to those time references in Revelation. So we saw one in Revelation 13 of 42 months, or another way to say it is 1,260 days. Okay, and we see it again in Revelation 11. Verse 2, do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for how long? 42 months, 3.5 years. And I will grant authority to my witnesses, and they will prophesy for how long? Okay, that's 3.5 years. Clothed in sackcloth, okay? So these time references equal 3.5 years. And so they connect that to Daniel chapter 9. 3.5 years equals how long? 7 years. There's the final week, okay? And so why this matters so much, this Daniel 9, those time references, and those time references in Revelation matching up, okay? Because it becomes the backbone for a future tribulation, okay? That's not present. The rise of the Antichrist, God's continual or picking back up his dealings with Israel and their restoration, the separation and distinction between Israel and the church. And all the while in this final week of tribulation, what's the church's role in dispensationalism? They don't have a role. All right, the church is out of here. Okay, they're raptured out. The church isn't present during this time, and really, that's for two reasons. We know that part of this tribulation has to deal with God's wrath being poured out. We talked about that in historic premillennialism. You remember that? And two, the church has to be gone for God to continue his dealings with Israel. Okay. And so some scriptures, 1 Thessalonians 5:9, which again, we talked about this in historic premillennial as well. God has not destined us for wrath. So that's interpreted that the church has to be out of the world when God pours his wrath out, because the church is not destined for wrath. Or again, Revelation 3:10. The Lord says, I will keep you from the hour of trial. And that's interpreted to be the time of tribulation. Okay. So the church is removed before tribulation. And another argument that dispensationals make is that after chapter 3, the church is no longer mentioned in the book of Revelation. How many of you have heard that before? Okay. And that after chapter 3, what's the first thing that happens in chapter 4? John is called up to the throne room. Okay? And they say that's a picture of the church being raptured and taken. How many of you have heard that before? Okay. So that represents the rapture of the church. Okay, questions? Or maybe another way to put it, is there anything in there that's, I don't know, another way to say it, not clear? Do what? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's two distinctives of dispensational premillennialism, okay? The rapture of the church, the taking out before the tribulation, and then a literal 7-year period of tribulation on the earth. And that comes from Daniel 9 and the time references in Revelation, and also the idea of God continuing his dealings with Israel once the church is out. Okay? All right, that leads to another distinction in this view, and that is the Israel and church distinction. Okay? That maybe you've heard it before, is that God has a spiritual people and God has a physical people. How many of you have heard that before? Anybody? No? Okay. This is one of the ways dispensationals talk about this. So who is God's people spiritually? Who's his spiritual people? The church. Who's God's people physically? Israel. Okay? And this is perhaps the most foundational theological issue for this view that sets it apart from all the other views. Okay? So my view, which is historic premillennialism, right? We looked at that, and in this view it says God has one people, and that people is anyone who trusts in Jesus. No matter your nationality, okay? It's one people through faith. Okay, and I think there's good reason for that. We looked at Romans 2, Romans 4, Galatians 2. Okay, we looked at all those verses about that. Ephesians 1. Okay, but the dispensational view teaches that, well, no, Israel and the church remain distinct. Okay, they're not the same. And some of the scriptures they point to would be like Romans 11. Romans 11, 25. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Right? So you see that? There's a partial hardening of who? Israel. Until fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Right? And so that would be viewed as who? The church. Okay, so there's this distinction. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. Who's that talking about? Israel. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. Now remember, Paul is writing at a time, and he's writing to a church in Rome, it's mostly Gentile, okay? And who were the biggest persecutors of the early church? It was Israel, it was Jewish, it was the Jews. That's what Paul's saying. They've been partially hardened. As regards to the gospel, they are enemies right now. But as regards election, that is, that God chose them. That's what that word means, to be chosen. As regards election, they are what? Beloved, for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Okay? So dispensationals look at Romans 11 and see here that this future restoration of Israel has to take place. And it does so after God is done dealing with the church. Okay? So you have this Israel distinction from Gentiles, the Gentile church. Okay? Another distinction we see in 1 Corinthians 10. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. How many of you know that one? Know that verse? All right, here's the next one. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. So dispensational, we'll see there's distinct categories for these people. Okay? And this matters because dispensationalists believe that there are Old Testament promises to Israel that must be fulfilled. Okay, how many of you have heard that before? Okay. That would include land promises, kingdom promises, and Davidic throne promises. So when I say land promises, what do I mean? The promised land, right? When I say kingdom promises, that they are this distinct people for God. And when I say Davidic throne promises, what do I mean? Think 2 Samuel chapter 7 Remember what the Lord says to David in 2 Samuel 7? Yeah, I'm going to make an everlasting covenant with you that from your seed there will be one who sits on the throne of David forever. Okay? They say that this has to be fulfilled. That's right. That's Jesus. Okay? So, one of the reasons why the church is removed during the time of tribulation is because it's during that time of tribulation God will finish these promises. Okay? So right now we are in the church age. The rapture will bring this age to an end. The tribulation will start. And during the time of tribulation, God will finish these promises to Israel. Okay? So think about that final week of Daniel. Right now, there's a pause button, right? When the church is taken out, the plans of God for Israel resume so that he can finish and fulfill these covenant promises to Israel. Okay? So during the tribulation in dispensationalism, Israel will repent and come to faith in Jesus. Okay? And he will finish those promises he'll begin them in the tribulation and finish them in the millennial kingdom. All right? So let's talk about those promises a little in a little more detail, and then we may have to finish for tonight. Okay, so the first is land promises. Okay, land promises. And that comes from Genesis 15, the covenant God made with who? You might remember. Abraham. Okay. That he promised a land with specific land boundaries. And so a dispensational says Israel has never fully possessed that land permanently. Okay? Even from the time they first entered the promised land, they never fully settled all the boundary of that land. Now, whose fault was that? It was Israel's fault. They didn't trust the Lord. And so there's sections of the land that they never fully possessed. Okay? And so, dispensationalists say God has to be true and faithful to that promise, and one day Israel will possess all that land that's been promised. Okay? So that fulfillment is still in the future. So land promises to Israel that must be fulfilled. Okay? The second is Davidic king promise. That's 2 Samuel chapter 7. That David's throne will be established forever. And so, dispensationalists believe that that promise will be fulfilled when Jesus reigns on the throne in the millennium. Right. He will establish his throne on the earth as the son of Jesse, right? From the line of David. And that kingdom will last for how long? Forever. Okay? And then, third, I called it kingdom promise, but really it's new covenant blessing. Okay, you remember Jeremiah 31? The Lord says, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant with who? Who does he say? The house of Israel. And so we say Jesus established that covenant in his blood, right? That's what we do at the Lord's table. We remember the new covenant that Jesus has purchased and established for us. Okay? But a dispensational will say, well, really, that covenant was promised to national Israel, and we're just grafted in, right? That's that Romans 11 language, okay? But national Israel has yet to be part of that covenant. You see that? So, the church participates spiritually in this new covenant now, but dispensationalists believe Israel still has a distinct future fulfillment when God will be faithful to that covenant promise to them. Okay? That's why this distinction between church and Israel is such a big deal in this view. Okay. Questions about that? Is that new stuff, or have we heard that before? Because again, remember, I started this, working through this view with the assumption that this is probably the one most of us have been taught and are familiar with. But if we need to go deeper into it, I mean, we're like 3 months into this thing already. Why not just spend a little more time if we need to? So I'm open to questions or comments. Mm-hmm. Sure. That's what I believe. Yeah, that's what I believe. That's right. Yes, I agree with that. Right? And that's why we spent some time when we was looking at the historic view, looking at Romans 2, Romans 4, Galatians 2, Ephesians 1, about how Paul really wants to emphasize that in Jesus, the wall that divides people, what happens to it? It's broken down. And then he literally says, so there is no Jew or Gentile. There is one people in Jesus. And then he says in Romans 2, right? It's not circumcision of the flesh, but circumcision of the heart that makes you a what? He says a Jew, a true Jew. And then he says in Romans 4 that it is the people of faith in Jesus who are the children of who? Abraham. And then he concludes in that, and heirs of the what? Promise. The promises. Okay? So, my view is that all these covenant promises, it's not that they've yet to be fulfilled, and it's not that they're fulfilled in the church, it's that they are fulfilled in Jesus. And it's the one people of God through faith in Jesus that these covenant promises are for, whether you're nationally Jewish or Gentile. Now, there is something to say about what Paul says in Romans 11, right? Because he's very specific that Romans 11 has to do with who? Jews. And so in the historic view, which is my view, it is that, yes, God still has plans for the Jewish people. And that is, they will be saved through Jesus. Okay, so my view doesn't just totally disregard that. Okay, I say my view, the historic view, the view I hold. Sir? Yes, I think that'll be in the church age, which again, the tribulation is at the same time in that. So it's not that you have a church age that ends and then there's tribulation, okay? But that the whole time of the church on the earth is also the time of tribulation. And I believe that towards the end, when things get really bad, okay, I believe that. I think there's an amping up of persecution and oppression before Jesus comes. And I think during that time, there's going to be this great turning of Jewish people to Jesus. Yes. Well, see, in my view, the tribulation is now, right? In this view, it would be during the 7-year tribulation. But I say the tribulation is the whole time of the church age. Or that's what the view I hold says. I know that's confusing. Because we're using the same words, but we interpret them differently. Does that make sense? So In your mind, when you say tribulation, you mean the 7-year time where it's really bad on the earth, right? Right. And when I say tribulation, I mean it's the whole experience of the church age. It's not a future thing that's coming. It's a present reality the church lives through. Yes, I do believe that. Before Jesus comes, it gets worse. I do believe that. All right. We are out of time. So we will have to finish it up next time. And we'll do 3 weeks on this view, but that's okay. And if we need to do more, we can. But I will say, those are the 3 things that are most distinct of this view. And when we finish up, we'll see a lot of overlap between what this view believes and what historic premillennialism believes. Okay? Any last question or comment or word? There you go. That's right. That's right.
God does not have a relationship with anyone that doesn't have Christ. I mean, he will respond to prayers and things like that. He's good to all. But to say that because someone is an Israelite, they don't even need the gospel.
Right.
There are people that believe that way.
Sure.
I think that's very dangerous.
Absolutely.
One thing that helps me understand that there is no distinction. I used to believe that there is a rapture and then there is a tribulation, a great tribulation. And then when you hear the explanation of what the great tribulation is that people are going to be suffering tremendously with persecution and beheadings and things like that. And I started thinking about the church in North Korea that already goes through that.
Yes.
The church in China that already goes through that.
Yes.
In Africa and Muslim majority nations. And I'm like, okay, so what's the difference? Why do we get to be raptured out of here so we don't go through that? But the people of God that are already going through that did not get raptured out of that.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to China and you start telling them that God is going to rescue them from the great tribulation that's coming, what great tribulation? We already have people being decapitated.
Right.
We already have people being, tortured and things like that. So it's not. I don't think the West is that special that God is going to take us out of here so we don't suffer while millions of Christians are suffering right now.
I think that's a great point.
I've always wondered, thought that to myself, that if Christ's own son had to suffer,
Right.
why would we not have to?
Mm-hmm. And I think the main point in Revelation is perseverance and endurance, right? Yes, keep believing, keep trusting. And the call is no matter what sort of tribulation, suffering, persecution, even to the point of death, right? And in fact, over and over again in Revelation, you read that, be faithful unto what? Death. It's like over and over and over in that. And so I think he's making a good point. It's the Western church that only reads Revelation in such a way that says God will get us out of here before it gets too bad. Because all across the world, people are living in conditions that the book of Revelation describes.
This is actually only in the past, maybe 200 years that there's the so-called freedom of religion. But the church, throughout its entire existence, just read the first 3 centuries.
Yeah.
It was worse than anything you can ever imagine, and the church grew 40% every year.
Right. Through the persecution.
And they were dying by the thousands.
Yeah. I think that's a good point for this. Absolutely. All right. We are out of time. We'll pick back up next week. Eric, would you pray for us, brother?